This is our annual community council event. In more normal times, we would be feeding you all dinner, but we tried to treat you in another way instead, and I think you will all find it very delicious. I want to take a moment to thank the members of our community council who are here and who have supported our program through donations, by serving on our executive committee, by coming to our events, helping to magnify our programs and spread the word about our Jewish Studies program. The Jewish Studies program was founded with community donations and community generosity 4 decades ago, and I'm very proud to count myself among such an accomplished group of scholars. I'm incredibly grateful to the community for continuing to support and encouraging this program, for coming to our talks, for being part of our intellectual community, and making this distance feel a little bit less distant. So I want to say something before I begin on a personal note about the pandemic, which at least here in San Diego feels like we're starting to near an end. It's been an exhausting year. It's been a tragic year for many people, including, I know, many people in San Diego. And it's also been a year of more
Send me the
personal
Zoom link.
growth than I've ever had. I will ask people to just make sure that their mics are muted. It's been a year of incredible personal growth as well. And, we all began this year, we academics, we faculty at UCSD, with this challenge to suddenly retool in the space of about a week as distance learning teachers. So between, something like March, I don't know, 20th and April 1st or something like that, we all had to completely redesign our teaching for online platforms, and our students had to go along with this. And in addition to that, everyone had personal challenges, from fear and isolation to health concerns to desiring a little bit more isolation for those of us with families. In addition to teaching, I was trying to edit a book, and my husband and I were trading off teaching and entertaining our children, who were then 4 and 6. And at a certain point in the spring, I was fetching to my mother over the phone about like how exhausted I was. And she said, "Well, what chapter books are you reading with the kids?" And I was like, "You're crazy. Like, I'm not sleeping. I have no time to sit on the couch and read chapter books." And at the same time, I was like, that sounds so nice. That's all I really want to do right now. And so we just, we did it. We started
Harry
to...
Potter.
Lerer, you're sitting back there. Well, while I talk, you're sitting back there. I invited my son, but on the condition that he's very quiet. So we read through Roald Dahl, we read through, Ramona Quimby, we read through the Kate DiCamillo books, and finally, my son, who's sitting right here, convinced me that it was time for us to read Harry Potter. And, he was way too young, but we dove into Harry Potter and emerged several months later with all of this wizarding knowledge. And, he may or may not have been too young for this, but we started to have these really deep conversations about things like religion. Leor asked me at one point, "Is there a God in Harry Potter?" So I'll save these questions. These are questions that I'm going to actually channel to Arun after he's given his talk about his translation of Harry Potter into Yiddish. But when I heard that some guy had translated the first Harry Potter book into Yiddish, I was immediately very curious and very excited about how this alternate universe of Harry and of the magical world might be placed into the alternate universe that is Yiddish. So what I love about this group of colleagues in Jewish studies and students is the diversity with which they treat the field of Jewish studies. And, this means approaching Jewish culture and civilization from the perspectives of history, literature, anthropology, sociology, economics, political science. So I'm just going to give a few highlights from this year, which are by no means exhaustive. I will... Yeah, I know, you know some of the people. Okay. This is a bit of a risk I'm taking here, inviting a 7-year-old to my Jewish studies talk, but we're going to just plow ahead. I'm going to start with my colleague Lisa Lampert-Weissig, who holds the Katzen Chair in Jewish civilization. And Professor Lampert-Weissig will be assuming the position of Jewish Studies Director on July 1st, taking over for me when I go on sabbatical. And indeed, the program is in the best possible hands. Lisa's been on leave in 2020, 2021. She's been compiling a book project. She's also published 2 new essays. One of them is about medieval and modern apocalypticism in the United States and the United Kingdom. And the other one is forthcoming later this year, which focuses on the medieval roots of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. Professor Lempert-Weissig has also been giving talks via Zoom for events in the UK and Germany for the Medieval Association of the Pacific. And she is the editor and one of the founders of the journal New Chaucer Studies. Sorry, I'm going to pause for 1 second. So the first issue of this journal, New Chaucer Studies, Pedagogy and Profession, which she is the founding editor of, appeared this past November in 2020. This is an open access journal, which means that scholars around the world will be able to read it for free. I'll move on to my colleague Mira Ballberg, who holds the endowed chair in ancient Jewish civilization. Mira, together with her colleague Professor Chaim Weiss of the Department of Hebrew Literature at Ben-Gurion University, published their joint study on the representations of old age in the Talmud and other rabbinic texts. Their co-authored book, When Year Became Far, Old Age in Rabbinic Literature, was just published by Oxford University Press. Many of you were present at their book event that they gave earlier this spring, and you got a preview of this really wonderful project. Mira also won the prestigious Andrew W. Mellon New Directions Fellowship this year. This is a fellowship that supports mid-career humanities scholars who are interested in moving into another field, and she has been studying cognitive science, working on a book project about memory, forgetting, and attention and distraction in the world of the ancient rabbis. So she has been involved in that all year. Tom Levy, who holds the Norma Kershaw Chair in the Archaeology of Ancient Israel and Neighboring Lands, has, among other things, been collaborating with marine archaeologist Asaf Yasur Landau, who's the director of the Rekanati Institute of Maritime Studies at the University of Haifa. And their joint work is focused on the recently discovered underwater ruins of Tel Dor, which is a Hellenistic port dating to around the 4th century before the Common Era. And together, Professors Levy and Landau have actually launched a joint University of Haifa and University of California, San Diego Maritime Archaeology Research Station. This was inaugurated in April of 2021, and the field station is located in the coastal town of Akko. So this is and Deborah Hertz, whose update I don't think I received in time, is hard at work on her study of women revolutionaries from Eastern Europe and their relationships to modernity. And I'm really incredibly grateful for Deborah's help and support throughout my time at UCSD. I wanted to just end the faculty updates by saying this is a bittersweet moment for me. I'm going to be stepping down as Jewish Studies Director on July 1st, passing the baton on to my colleague Lisa. I'll be going on sabbatical next year. I'll spend my year as a fellow at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute, starting a new book project involving East European poets today and their portrayals of identity. So despite being a virtual year, we have continued to collaborate with the Gallinson Initiative this year. We're very pleased that we've been hosting Mor Shilon, who has been teaching courses in the Urban Studies program at UCSD, and I'm very pleased to announce that she will be staying on and continuing to teach next year. I'm also pleased to share that the Gallinson Initiative will be bringing new fellows next year, including Yuval Gadot, who gave a talk earlier this spring, and we'll be hosting talks by Ori Elon, who is the writer and creator of Shtisel, very popular TV show on Netflix, and Syed Kashua, who is, among other things, the writer of Arab Labor. Among other talks, they're going to be visiting with our Hebrew language class taught by Professor Alana Schuster. So I want to take a moment now to honor our graduate students who received fellowships for the current year. And I'm really pleased to share with all of you, very appropriately for the Community Council event, that given our limitations of distanced events, we were able to award more graduate fellowships both last year and this year than usual, because we were able to use some of our event funding that's used for travel and funnel that towards our grad students. So I'm really pleased to announce our named fellowship award winners for the current year who are just ending their fellowship years. Rachel Hennings received the Goodblatt Fellowship, which is usually a travel fellowship, but she was able to use it for remote learning of Yiddish. And her work focuses on the intersection between religious confession, capitalism, and business practice in the Wilhelmine period in Germany. Karina Vahitova, who receives the Captain in Perpetuity Fellowship, one of two that we were able to award last year, does research that focuses on ethnicity and race in early Soviet, contemporary Eastern European, and hemispheric American cultures. Rebecca Futterman, who is in theater and dance and received the second Captain in Perpetuity Fellowship for this year, is working on writing a one-woman show that examines the experience of being Jewish in today's day and age. And her research has taken her in circuitous directions on Zoom. And Beatrice Waterhouse, who receives the Gumpel Fellowship for the current year, is examining the discursive methods used by Israeli Supreme Court justices to keep the categories Jewish and Israeli citizen legally congruent despite their changing definitions in public opinion and the law, with special attention to precedent-setting law of return cases. So I want to thank our students, those mentioned, as well as our other Jewish studies undergraduate and graduate students, my colleagues, the core and affiliate faculty members in Jewish studies, the UCSD administration, in particular the Dean of Arts and Humanities, Christina Della Coletta, and the Dean of Social Sciences, Carol Payden, for their support. I also want to share a particular thanks to the faculty and staff in the Institute of Arts and Humanities, which houses the Jewish Studies program. Thanks in particular to Professor Nancy Kwok, who directs the Institute for Arts and Humanities, and the Associate Director, Simeon Mann, as well as the MSO, who organizes everything in the program, Catherine Levy, and Anna Marie Buenviaje, who has managed and organized our programs. And I want to thank Jennifer Deely, who has interfaced with our students. She's our student advisor. So this is our event to thank all of you in the Community Council for the support that you give us. Without further ado, I am very excited to introduce our speakers for tonight. Arun Viswanath is originally from Teaneck, New Jersey. He grew up in a Yiddish and Tamil-speaking home, and his translation of Harry Potter und der philosophischer Stein is his first foray into literary translation, but from what I have gleaned, it will likely not be his last. This is a wonderful addition to our general knowledge of Harry Potter and the world of Harry Potter, but also of translation. And I'll just add that Arun does descend from a family of Yiddish scholars and writers, the Schechter family. I got to study with his grandfather, Mordechai Schechter, many years ago when I was a graduate student. And Seth Lerer is Distinguished Professor of Literature at UC San Diego. He is also the former Dean of Arts and Humanities and has worked closely with the Jewish Studies program in this capacity. He is the author of a number of books. I will not name all of them, but these include Children's Literature, A Reader's History from Aesop to Harry Potter, which came out in 2008 and won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism and the Truman Capote Prize in Criticism. And, among his many other books is Inventing English, A Portable History of the Language from 2007. He also created a critical edition, an annotated edition of The Wind and the Willows, which came out in 2009. And I've had the privilege of knowing Seth and getting to work with Seth in many different capacities, beginning when I was a graduate student and took my first independent study course in translation with him, of all things, a million years ago at Stanford. So Arun, I'm going to hand the floor over to you, and welcome to UC San Diego.
Thank you so much, Professor Glaser, and thank you to the Jewish Studies program for having me. It's really a pleasure. I'm on the East Coast, so it's wonderful with all of the challenges that this pandemic brings to be able to visit so many wonderful places in the world. I'm really honored to be here. So I am just going to share my screen. Is everybody able to see that? Okay, wonderful. So if you have any questions over the course of the next 15 to 25 minutes, feel free to throw it in the chat. I will try to monitor the chat as we go along, but we'll also have some dedicated time afterwards for question and answers. So fear not. So we will get started with 2 interactive questions. Oh, thank you, Anna Marie. So the first question is, have you read Harry Potter in translation? Your choices are yes, sort of, no, and well, hopefully nobody answers the 4th one. For your sake. Okay, well, that can easily be remedied. Okay, we'll give it another 5 seconds or so.
Do we need to give instructions on using the poll? Does everyone maybe really quickly just point to where people need to mark yes or no?
It should
Under
be
reactions. So if you look down at the bottom, there's like security participants, chat, share screen. You may not have all of these things on yours. There's reactions at the far right, so you can mark yes or no.
okay. Most people have responded, so I think I'm just going to end the poll so we can all see where we stand. So most of us have only read the original. Okay, so I'll do my best to give some context on what makes Harry Potter really quirky to translate. And let's move on to the second one. Okay, so which house of Hogwarts are you in? Hogwarts has 4 residential houses. One of them is Gryffindor, which in Yiddish is Golden Griff, Hufflepuff, which in Yiddish is Hufflepuff. Ravenclaw is Robbenkrell, and Slytherin is Samderin. I can't respond to the poll, but I'm a Raven. I'm a Ravenclaw, a Robbenkrell. Give it another 10 seconds. Okay, I think we're all set. So now that you all know which Hoys you belong to, I'm going to share the results here. We're pretty evenly split. We are going to hear the first, or rather the entire Song of the Sorting Hat, the Song of the Sortierhit, or Sortierhut if you're a Litvak, in Yiddish. So I will put, thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I'll be reading a stanza in English and then a stanza in Yiddish. And feel free to read aloud on your own on mute. For those who have not read Harry Potter, the Sorting Hat is the ancient pointy hat which first-year students put on their heads at the point of matriculation to find out which residential house they will be sorted into. So this song describes the various residential houses and the characteristics of those that belong to them. Oh, you may not think I'm pretty, but don't judge on what you see. I'll eat myself if you can find a smarter hat than me. And I should note, I'm going to be reading this in my native Ukrainian dialect, so please don't take offense if I don't pronounce the words the way that you're used to. Siz man punim nish kenshonait, na de shenkeit gunish zukt. Gege fin mir noch a hittel, was a kop wie mans vermukt. You can keep your bowlers black, your top hats sleek and tall, for I'm the Hogwarts sorting hat, and I can cap them all. Hey, die Kepke Kitschme Kapelich, die Streimel ausgepitzte. Seid schon Meuchel, ich bin das, der Same Kimzenitzter. There's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see. So try me on, and I will tell you where you ought to be. Der Hogwartser sortierhit weist dan etzem in dan kern, to mest machun in herme Venus, wem dit hist gehern. You might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring nerve and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. Zu Goldengriff gehören die mit Herz galant in Dresd. Sie teilen sich aus mit Gewirre, oder was Gewirre heißt. You might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. Gehörst die wieder Hufflepuff, den Joischer holst die Teier. Mats nicht aus der Horavanje in beständig a Getreier. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Beschert zu seinen Robbenkrell is der mit scharfen Sinnen, wie Unhängers von Wissen in von Klügschaft sich gefinnen. Or perhaps in Slytherin, you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folk use any means to achieve their ends. Sie efsche treffst die echte Freundin Samdrin den Chitrin, wie bei dem Ziel der Griechen seinen Kuscher alle Mitteln. So put me on, don't be afraid, and don't get in a flap. You're in safe hands, though I have none, for I'm a thinking cap. Tatima chunit, schreck sich nicht, ich leg auf dich in Hand. Ich bin fort bloß assortiert, gut a freundlich Stück gewandt. So let's take a few steps backwards and figure out how in the world did we get here? Why does the world need Harry Potter in Yiddish? To explain that, we'll spend a little bit of time on what Yiddish is, what in the world I'm doing here talking to you about Yiddish, and a little bit about Harry Potter. Yiddish, as most of you will know, is the Ashkenazi vernacular spoken in Eastern Europe by Jews about 10 million or so at the eve of World War II. Today, it's spoken largely by Hasidic Jews and other ultra-Orthodox Jews who have maintained the language in their day-to-day. At the beginning, or rather at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the literature and culture of Yiddish was really blooming and flourishing. This, of course, is a picture of Shalom Aleichem, one of the early famous writers of Yiddish, known as one of the Drei Klassiker, one of the three classic Yiddish writers. And Yiddish continued to bloom up until World War II, where, of course, a large portion of Ashkenazic Jewry among broader Jewry was decimated, and Yiddish took a large hit. Even before that point, and certainly after that point, Yiddish continued to decline outside of the sectors that I mentioned due to immigration and acculturation to the various countries that Jews traveled to. However, there were some families that continued to speak Yiddish. One of those families happened to be my own family. This is myself and one of my cousins hiding in a box for unknown reasons. But we grew up speaking Yiddish with each other. I spoke Yiddish with my mother, or I speak Yiddish with my mother and my siblings, now with my daughter, and with all of my cousins and aunts and uncles. Our family was one of a number that subscribed in the interwar period to the ideology of Yiddishism, one of many isms that flourished during that period. And the idea behind Yiddishism was that Yiddish is extremely valuable as a language of the Jewish people, not the language, but as a language of the Jewish people. And so we continue to speak Yiddish in an unbroken chain until today. And so growing up in the suburbs of New York City, in Teaneck, New Jersey, it was a little bit odd not having very much contemporary children's literature to read. Of course, there was the classic Yiddish literature that everybody knows of, Shalom Aleichem and Peretz and all of that. But if you actually start reading their work, it's not really geared towards children, even when they say that it is. And there was also quite a bit of children's literature, and there is, coming out of the Hasidic world, but the themes and the subject matter was often explicitly moralizing and not quite what I was looking for as a kid. I was interested in R.L. Stine and K.A. Applegate, and all of the wonderful series that Professor Glaser mentioned. And of course, one of those was Harry Potter. I'm a child of the generation that grew up almost alongside Harry in the narrative. And I always wish that we could have Harry Potter or some other piece of classic, just American Western children's literature, young adult literature to read. And Harry Potter, of course, has been translated into very many languages, over 80 at this point. It is also I believe, the best-selling book series in history. It's not the best-selling book in history, that would be the Bible, but it is the best-selling book series. And when I was speaking with my wife before the arrival of our recently born daughter, I told her that I was adamant that I would be speaking Yiddish with our child, and she asked me if I was seriously considering raising a child in a world that didn't have Harry Potter in Yiddish. And so I took the challenge very seriously. And it truly is a challenge. Harry Potter is a work, the universe is, of course, a magical one, which exists in an alternate universe, but culturally, it's very much that of contemporary British culture, boarding school culture, which is not something that really exists within Yiddish, but really translating it to any language would bring with it some of these challenges of cultural transposition. Yiddish comes with an additional challenge that it is what many linguists call a specifically Jewish language. The idea being that the Jewishness is encoded within Yiddish. Many might contend that it is impossible to speak Yiddish without speaking in a Jewish fashion. Some might debate this claim, but you get the idea. So, of course, one could be tempted when translating Harry Potter to try to just convert, perhaps literally convert everything to being Ashkenazi Jews, where you have a world where we're dealing with Herschel Tepper and Chana and Leuven instead of Harry, Hermione, and Ron. I felt that I couldn't do that, and I'm quite sure that the author would not have allowed it either. And so the challenge for myself and my editors was really to figure out how does one translate such a work that is so culturally specific to a certain place and time, which is not Jewish, and render that into Yiddish in a way that feels natural to Yiddish, and yet at the same time doesn't necessarily explicitly convert the characters to be Jewish. So on a very surface level, there are some phonetic challenges. Yiddish is written in the Yiddish alphabet, which has a set of sounds that does not include some sounds that exist in English. One of these sounds is the soft TH sound. And so we will revisit one of the residential houses that we mentioned earlier, Slytherin. Slytherin is, of course, a wonderful pun in the original English. It refers to the mascot of Slytherin House, which is a snake. And it is well known that the founder of Slytherin House was a person who could speak to snakes, and the members of Slytherin House are known to be really quite sly and cunning. And so I could have just rendered it as Slytherin, so just getting rid of the TH sound and replacing it with a sound that's native to Yiddish, but that would have lost the pun. And so the job of the translator is to figure out how can we reproduce this as much as possible, maintaining the shape of the word and the feel of the word, such that when the reader reads it, they understand exactly what is being referred to, even if they haven't read the original. And so I tried various permutations. I wanted to use the Yiddish word for snake, which is schlang, but I was told that this might perhaps be misinterpreted by those who are not as familiar with Yiddish vernacular and perhaps more familiar with the English. And so we had to go a different route. It occurred to me, thinking through various words related to snakes, that the Yiddish word for poison or venom is sam. Some of you may know this word from Hebrew, from modern Hebrew, where it means a drug, but in Yiddish it means poison. And derin meaning inside or therein. And so you put those together and you get samderin, which literally means there is venom therein, or there is poison inside. And so this was one of the places where I got really lucky, and Yiddish provided me with the exact linguistic material that I was looking for. One can't always be this lucky, but occasionally it happens. I appear to have left my screen. Okay. We have another poll. Lord Voldemort, or Voldemort, is the villain of the Harry Potter series, according to most interpretations. So it is written with a T at the end. The word appears to be borrowed from French, and so one might argue that the T should be silent. Some might argue that the T is certainly pronounced, as this is an English-speaking person. So which is it? Is the T pronounced? Is it not? Or is it more complicated? I'll wait another 10 seconds for the responses to roll in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. Still got some responses coming in. Okay, apologies to those who did not get the responses in. I'm going to share the results. Okay, so we have a pretty split audience here. The answer is you're all correct. As it turns out, the author has been caught on tape saying Voldemort, and yet she insists that it should be pronounced Voldemort. But what this allows for me as the translator is a little bit of leeway in terms of how I want to render the name in Yiddish. Well, you might ask, why does it matter? Either you put a tess at the end and you get Voldemort, or you don't add a tess at the end and you just get Voldemort. Why should it matter? Well, as we just saw one example of, Rowling is quite the fan of wordplay. And for those of you who are familiar with the Harry Potter series and have read the second book, you'll know that towards the end of the second book, he reveals himself to be the same person as Tom Riddle, and the letters of his full name, Tom Marvolo Riddle, rearrange into an anagram, namely, I am Lord Voldemort, or Lord Voldemort. And so in Yiddish, it really matters whether you add that tess in there, because that is going to make your life a lot easier or a lot harder, depending on what direction you go in creating the anagram. In other languages, some have been really quite brilliant. I believe the Danish version couldn't figure out how to keep the anagram entirely in Danish. And so they had one side of the anagram be in Latin, and it said, Ego sum Lord Voldemort. But I do not have that ability to render Latin in Yiddish. And so I ended up going with Voldemort without the test. Unfortunately, I haven't finished book 2 yet, so I can't tell you for sure what the anagram is. So you'll have to wait for the second book to come out. But it is worked out, and it does work. So, so far we've really dealt with some of the more phonetic examples, but to get a little bit to the meat of it, what are the ways in which we can create a translation into Yiddish which feels Jewish and yet doesn't explicitly convert the characters of the storyline into Jewish? The Mirror of Arizod is an object which appears in the first book. It is a mirror, which Arizod is just desire spelled backwards. And it shows you not your own reflection, but it shows you your deepest desire. And when Harry looks in this mirror, he sees himself surrounded by his family. Now, a peculiar thing about the Mirror of Arizod is, just to flip back here, you might be able to see on the frame of the mirror is written out this inscription, which is just English backwards. And I'm not going to try to read the backwards English, but if you reverse it, it says, I show not your face, but your heart's desire. And it's really these situations in the original where there's already wordplay happening that the translator has quite a bit of leeway to get a little bit creative, as you also heard in the Sorting Hat song. And so I tried just translating I show not your face, but your heart's desire. And I turned it backwards and it didn't look particularly interesting, but I realized, I remembered that there is a slang term in Yiddish for when you want to say that something is gibberish, you say that it's Targum-Loshn. Targum-Loshn literally means the language of the Targum, the language of the Aramaic translation of the Bible. And wouldn't it be cool if we could get this Yiddish sentence to turn backwards and look like Aramaic? And so I had to find a lot of Yiddish words that have an aleph in them so that when I turn it backwards, you can sort of, if you squint and you don't look too closely, it sort of looks like Aramaic, but it's really gibberish. So the Yiddish is nicht das punim in mir sei, nor the mahatzbager, not the face in me you see, but rather the heart's desire. And I'm not going to try to read it in Aramaic because it is gibberish. Harry Potter is, of course, filled with a variety of magical terminology. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go through all of them, as fun as they all are. So we'll pick one, and that is Quidditch. Quidditch is the most popular sport in the wizarding world, after gobstones, of course. And Quidditch itself is apparently, according to urban legend, the name of the sport is a mix of the three types of balls that are used in the sport. Is the sport played flying on brooms, throwing balls into large hoops on either end of the field. So kind of like soccer on brooms with in the air, of course, with multiple hoops. Some languages simply call it Quidditch or Quidditch or whatever the exact phonetic rendering is. Some languages do get a little bit more specific. The Scots English translation calls it Bisimba, and you'll understand in a second why that translation called it Bisimba. I was trying to figure out what would be a Yiddish appropriate translation for this name. Of course, it could have just been Quidditch, kind of even rhymes with Yiddish, and it sounds like a reasonably Yiddish name. But then it occurred to me that there is this phrase in Yiddish, which shows up among a number of writers, including one of my favorite, Itzik Mange, which is "As Gott will schießt er Besim." Some of you may know it in Hebrew. It is current in Hebrew as well. If God wills it, even a broom can shoot. Or perhaps the older version of this means even a broom can sprout flowers. But let's go with a broom can shoot. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could take this Yiddish aphorism and somehow inject it into the name of the sport? And so I took schieß, meaning shoot, and besim, meaning broom, and smushed it together, and we got schießbesim. And so in Yiddish, Quidditch is shoot broom. And it was only later that I found out that the Scots English term bisimba, the term bism, is cognate with the Yiddish besim and is also parallel to a dialectal English term similar to Scots English for a broom. So I wasn't the first one to come up with the idea, but it did feel very at home in Yiddish. Okay, we're going to do our last poll. The pudding, some might say, or the special dish that is eaten on Shabbos or Shabbat, often with potatoes, sometimes with apples or noodles. Do you pronounce it as kugel or kegel? Or do you eschew the dish altogether? I'll give another 10 seconds for those responses to come in. Thank you, everybody, for revealing your deepest, darkest secrets. All righty. I'm going to end the poll here. Share the results. Okay, so most of you are consumers of Kugel, but we do have some Kegel here. Okay, so most of you will probably be aware that Kugel and Kegel are variants of the same word. I'm going to close off this poll now. The same word, which varies by dialect. Yiddish historically has had quite a number of dialects. To simplify it greatly, we can break it down into the northern dialect. Oh, hold on a second. The northern dialect, often called Litvish Yiddish, the Yiddish of historical Lithuania, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But by the time of World War II, also included large swaths of Poland. And you have Galician Yiddish, which is the language of Central Europe. So more like, or I shouldn't say Central Europe, Central Yiddish. So the language of Hungary and of certain parts of Poland. And then, of course, there's my dialect, Ukrainian, but we'll leave that aside for now. So let's just take the opposition of Litvish Yiddish and Galician Yiddish. It so happens, as many of you will probably also be aware, that each of these dialects tends to be associated with a certain archetype, or one might say a caricature of those that spoke these dialects of Yiddish. And so it occurred to me that there might be an opportunity to map this alternate universe of Harry Potter onto the historical map of Yiddish speakers. And so this is our beloved yet quite stern Professor Minerva McGonagall. And of course, it seems most appropriate that she would be associated with the Litvaks, who tend to be a bit more severe in their manner. They tend to take a no-nonsense approach to things. And if McGonagall is a Litvak, well then, there must be a Galiciana somewhere. And we know that Galicianas, again, this is a caricature, so nobody take this, nobody take any offense, but they tend to be warm and friendly, perhaps a bit bumbling, perhaps a bit more lower class socioeconomically. And of course, the perfect person for that is Hagrid, our groundskeeper. And actually mapping on the dialects onto the universe of Harry Potter was not really something that I pulled out of thin air. This is something that, of course, exists within the book itself. Hagrid is very obviously speaking some sort of Western country accent, as is apparent from all the apostrophes. And well, if Hagrid was going to speak a dialect, it seemed appropriate that others would speak a dialect as well. And so in addition to McGonagall being a Litvak, we also have two other Litvaks so far, which seemed obvious to me. One is Professor Snape, and the other is Professor Argus Filch. And it's not just a matter of pretending, well, this person's a Litvak and this person's a Galiciana. The dialects, even though most of the differences tend to come up in phonetics, there is the opportunity to reflect this not only by adding apostrophes to show Hagrid's clipped speech as the Galiciana, but Litvish and Galician Yiddish also differ in terms of the actual grammar and vocabulary that's used. And so the discerning eye will be able to notice when Litvish Yiddish is being spoken versus Galician Yiddish. And I believe this is the last piece. Do we have time for one more piece, Professor Glaser? Or?
We should probably wrap up pretty quickly, but yeah,
Wonderful.
I think we can, last little bit, and then we'll turn it over to Seth to
okay, wonderful.
To spare you off course.
Okay, wonderful. So there is, of course, this entire world of made-up fantastical creatures. This is, of course, the gold coin loving Niffler. In some cases, Yiddish already has a word that has been inherited from its Germanic ancestry. So in this case, we'll leave aside whether goblins are an unflattering stereotype of an ethnic group known to all of us. But Yiddish has a word for goblin, and that's kobold, which is cognate with the English word cobalt, the traditional sprites living in underground mines. And yet there's other cases where if you look in Yiddish folklore, there are creatures that seem very, very similar to the elves, the house elves that are depicted in the Harry Potter books. And so if you flip open the old ethnographic research performed by the Yiva at the turn of the 20th century, they gathered quite a number of legends of a creature which sneaks in at night and finishes all of your work for you. And if you leave out clothes, it will grab them and it will never come back, for it has been freed. So Davi is a free elf, not only in English, but in Yiddish. All segments of Jewish society are reading this, not only Hasidim, and I'm very happy to see that even those who don't know Yiddish are buying it to have it on their bookshelves. And so I hope that you all have the opportunity to come across Harry Potter in translation, and perhaps that will be the translation in Yiddish. That's all I had prepared, and Shainem Dank.
A großen Dank, everyone. So those of you who have questions, please go ahead and start to type them into the chat, but I'm going to turn the floor now over to my colleague, Professor Seth Lerer, to pose some questions. If there's enough time, I will add some of my own, but I also want to get to the audience questions.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Arun. I think this was really quite remarkable. Few people realize that there is actually in the Gershwin song, Let's Call the Whole Thing Off, there is actually a suppressed Yiddish couplet. You say fligel and I say flugel. You say kiggle and I say kugel. Fligel, flugel, kiggle, kugel. Let's call the whole thing off. But that is actually something that I think dovetails with your dialectical conversation. There are a few things that I would like to bring in, and really not just questions for Arun, but for all of us. And these include ways of understanding the challenges, not just of translating Harry Potter into Yiddish, but some of the larger contexts for Harry Potter. And let me go through them briefly and somewhat systematically. I think it's not unfair to say that even though Harry Potter seems to be set in a contemporary British world, it's very much a Dickensian world. It's very much a world of late Victorian cities. Diagon Alley, which is a pun on Queer Street, queer meaning diagonal. Diagon Alley, Mr. Ollivander's shop, all of the various names are deeply Dickensian, and there is a Dickensian quality to Hogwarts and the school story there. We'll notice that there's virtually no digital technology in Harry Potter, and that automobiles and other forms of technology seem to have a deliberately archaic effect. So what I'm suggesting is that for British audiences in particular, and for American audiences too, the patina of Harry Potter is a patina of an imagined past, a nostalgia for this earlier world of pudding and Christmas time. And as we know, nostalgia is a memory of something that never happened. And I use that to think about Yiddish as well, and to ask about really the literary issues at stake here. Arun gave us some very interesting templates for understanding phonetics and dialect, or for naming. But part of my question is, what is the nature of literary Yiddish? I think that for many people of my generation and sensibility, Yiddish is an ornamental language. That is, it is not a language in which everyday discourse went on, and it certainly was not a language that had a heightened literary form. Whereas for, as Arun said, writers like Shalom Lechem or Agnon or Peretz, or later on someone like Singer, Yiddish becomes a literary language. And the real question from the point of view of literary studies is, what is literary about literary Yiddish? And does the translation that we're doing here, that you're doing here, aspire to it? The second thing I want to bring out is that Arun showed the picture of the Gringotts elf, which many people noticed does have a sort of iconically anti-Semitic caricature about it. And it's probably not unfair to say that a figure like Snape, with his long hair, greasy hair, his big nose and his ill-fitting cloak, has the three attributes of 19th century anti-Semitic Dickensian caricature. The hair, the cloak, and the nose are Fagin from Oliver Twist. They're Coppelius from E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman. And as Professor Lampert-Weissig well knows, these are anti-Semitic stereotypes that survived well into the Dracula and Nosferatu tradition. Now, I wouldn't claim that Rowling is in any sense anti-Semitic, but it is interesting, at least to me, that there are these tropes of otherness that are literary tropes that get deployed in the Harry Potter books. One could argue too that there are tropes of queer life, that aspects of werewolf life. Lupin is certainly played as queer, especially in the films. And there's a lot of homosocial, if not homosexual, sensibility to some of the schoolroom world. And in a language like Yiddish, and in a tradition where sexual otherness, or what we might call non-normativity, although my students tell me don't call it non-normativity because that implies that there is a normative. But certainly the question of difference is one that a traditional language like Yiddish might be concerned with. And the last question I'd ask is really, is there a living Yiddish? That is Yiddish a living language, not in the sense that people are speaking it to each other, but is Yiddish a language that is growing? Is it expanding in vocabulary and idiom? Is it adapting to the world? Is it bringing in a contemporary way of looking at experience? Or is the decision to speak in Yiddish a decision really to preserve oneself in a kind of linguistic amber? Is Yiddish a deliberately archaic language? And I'm asking these provocatively, and I'm hoping that the answer is A, yes, it's living, and B, it's not archaic, but I'd like to know what makes it living. In a very different way, for example, I have a friend my age who grew up in Ladino-speaking Istanbul, whose line to me is that Ladino is no longer a living language precisely because its speakers are speaking in a self-conscious, archaistic, or historical frame, whether or not that's true. But I think that it's probably not unfair to ask Arun how his translation is invigorating the language, not just turning Rowling's English into Yiddish, but in a sense, changing Yiddish as a literary, as a children's, as an imaginative tongue, and what impact that might have. Those are the kinds of questions that I have. And I'm sure many people have more questions, but if Arun or anyone else as equally informed in the language and culture wants to approach it, I'm going to turn it over. And thank you again.
Seth, thank you so much. And I wanted to just make an observation as a reader, and I haven't read the whole thing, but I've kind of read bits and patches of it, that I feel like the Yiddish is like very Lebedik and even a little bit more modern in Harry's speech sometimes than in some of the older characters. Maybe that's just me. Maybe I just identify more with the younger characters or something, but I find that Harry's Yiddish is like the Yiddish that I might, hear in conversation at like a Yiddish Woch or something. But I don't know. I don't know if you managed to like infuse a kind of generational living language. Is that the case?
These are all wonderful questions. I'll try to address them briefly or perhaps all in one. And I think they all kind of speak to the same central question. Yiddish as a literary language morphed into what it became towards the middle of the 20th century as a combination in many ways, as a distillation of all of the spoken forms of Yiddish. And in that sense, it attained a very neutral tone, which of course had much room to play with precisely because there's all these registers and dialects available to be taken advantage of. But what Yiddish never developed, understandably, is a register or a tone which matches that of 21st century young adult fantasy literature. And so there's a real challenge in figuring out how, without creating a new register entirely out of thin air, which risks alienating readers who might be completely unmoored as a result. How does one make use of the existing registers and employ them in a way that feels native to the genre? And so, Professor Glaser, perhaps what you were picking up on was my attempt to mirror the speech of Harry and his peers in their sort of informal colloquial English, which stands in contradistinction to the more stern formal speech of the teachers, which also stands in distinction to the very ironic and self-aware tone of the narrator, which reads almost like Singer or like Shelley. It really reads in many ways like some of these classic writers who are keenly aware that there are strange things happening in the air, and they go just far enough to bring it out without saying it explicitly. And so in that sense, Yiddish is a very vibrant language. Professor Lerer, to your question of is Yiddish a living language? Of course, within the Hasidic world, Yiddish is used as a day-to-day vernacular, and many will see Yiddish as the primary mode of fencing off the outside world, to act as a buffer in order to maintain the traditional way of life. And yet the irony is, or perhaps because Yiddish is the buffer, the Yiddish of the Hasidic world has actually undergone tremendous change over the course of the last few generations. And we're only now starting to see serious scholarship looking at the various ways in which Hasidic Yiddish, the various forms of Yiddish spoken by Hasidic and modern Haredi communities differ in their vocabulary, in the way that they have really welcomed in a flood of vocabulary from the surrounding co-territorial languages, the same way that Yiddish has for centuries, in terms of grammatical structures and even in terms of pronunciation. And so from that sense, it is certainly the case that the Hasidic Yiddish or Hasidic Yiddishes are expanding and bringing in the contemporary linguistic elements. The Yiddish spoken outside of Hasidic communities in many ways is phonologically and in terms of vocabulary and syntax and grammar, but by necessity and aspirationally frozen in amber, because the act of speaking Yiddish, I am one of those people, even though it's been an unbroken chain, my choice to speak Yiddish is precisely that. It is a choice. It is not an act of convenience. It is an act of conscience. And so the act of speaking Yiddish is in and of itself a sort of a realization of that underlying nostalgia. And because of that, it is necessarily frozen in amber. And so I think the answer is yes and no. In the Yiddishist community today, we're also seeing the incorporation of very modern elements of how shall we say? Well, there's a large overlap between the Yiddishist community and the queer community, and so there is quite a lot of activity within the Yiddishist community on figuring out how does one speak in a gender-neutral fashion, how does one work to eradicate racist terms or terms that are tainted with racist implications. And so in that sense, again, we see in the Yiddishist community, even though there is this aspiration to a nostalgia, there is also there's this adamant decision to also force Yiddish to reckon with the questions that face us in the modern world. And my last note to your question about otherness is, I'll just say a very brief anecdote. My father-in-law grew up in Switzerland, in Basel. His father was the chief rabbi there. And after he finished reading the Harry Potter series, he exclaimed, "How did Rowling know what it was like to grow up as a Jew in Europe?" And so that otherness exists on many different levels. One might argue the primary one is that of the Muggles and the Wizards, where the Wizards are sort of squirreled away in this hidden world where they try to stay away from danger. They don't want to be found out. Perhaps there's a cautionary tale around power and what happens around the relationship between power and oppressed groups. There's quite a lot to be excavated there. Perhaps some of it is a stretch, but I think that's the beauty of Harry Potter, is that I'll say perhaps heretically, you must turn it over and turn it over because all is in it. Like I said, Harry Potter is the best-selling series in the world, after the Bible, which is the best-selling book in the world. And for many, Harry Potter really does contain those multitudes. So thank you for all those questions, and I hope that I addressed them.
I want to just piggyback a little bit on what you were just saying, if I can jump in, and please go ahead and put your questions in the chat, but also you can just write stack and I'll call on you as you put yourselves into the chat or raise your yellow hand. So when we were arriving a couple months ago at the end of book 7, my son at one point said to me, "Who's stronger, God or Voldemort?" And I was like, and I had to then say, well, it kind of depends on the epistemology that you're like dealing with. And there's different universes with, what story and what powers are you believing in and what condition. And then that was when he asked, well, is there God at all in Harry Potter's world? And I think that's one of the questions underlying the book, right? J.K. Rowling clearly is writing this Christological story. Harry Potter's the chosen one. The magic people are the chosen people. And, it's a Christian allegory, just like a lot of these Victorian books that she was modeling it on. But, on the other hand, as Seth has pointed out, there are all of these anti-Semitic stereotypes. And as you've mentioned, being magical is a little bit like being Jewish in Europe. And, I don't think you can use a translation to plumb the depths of that, but I do think that a translation can unearth some of these things, right? Some of these issues of, well, is there a, is there a hidden commentary around Harry and chosenness in the book? Is there a Messiah? Are there Lamed-Vovniks? Like, what, are there these characters? And without localizing the book completely, I can see that you've found ways of using language and using certain tidbits from folklore of allowing the connections to at least be there, to at least be bridges if one wants to follow them. And so I guess that's the biggest question that I have for you, and that is, the theology of Harry Potter is very weird and very big. And did you go there at all as a translator? I mean, it seems like you've thought through a lot of these things, even the things that you decided to not touch. What role does prayer have? What role does Lashon Kodesh have? What role does holiness have in this book?
That's a big one. I think that when it comes to rendering what would initially appear to be a secular world, but very quickly is revealed to be one that not only on a high level clearly has all these Christian undertones, but is also very Christian normative and takes place in a Christian world where there's a Christmas tree, and one can't really change that. And you even have things like Harry Potter and Ron are running out of a room and praying that the troll isn't about to come out at them. And so I typically tried to steer clear. And luckily, because Yiddish has been spoken in so many different milieus, including in really quite atheist, anti-religious Soviet Union, spoken by intellectuals who explicitly rejected their religious upbringing. There were linguistic tricks that one could employ in order to get around having to say that they said a tefillah, they said a tefillah, a Jewish prayer. But there's also no way around the Christmas tree. I know that I'm not answering your deeper question, but one other thing I will add is that in Yiddish, it is in many ways obligatory to acknowledge the existence of a higher power, even in a not explicitly religious context. It would be, some might even say ungrammatical, but at the very least unfelicitous, to refer to the possibility of something bad happening without saying chalila, which, essentially means God forbid. And so Hermione, who's constantly worried about, being found out or getting kicked out of the school, she's constantly saying chalila. And so I think that the way around it, or the way to deal with it, is to let the characters be themselves as they normally would be in Yiddish, try to avoid explicit religious references, and mostly let the allegories be, because there's not much you can do there. Yes, but perhaps I will be forced to reckon with it in a more serious fashion in the later book.
If I could just chime in, one of the most powerful charms, or one of the most powerful curses, charms, whatever it is, that incantations is, of course, the levi corpus, which means raise the body. And I think that in many ways, I've argued that this is a sort of comic parody of the resurrection, that the whole idea of Harry Potter is imbued with this very Victorianized, Christianized, resurrectional fantasy. The Horcruxes, the whole sort of sacramentality of it all. And, I realize, you've just done the first volume, but I think Amelia's point is well taken, which is to say, how much of any translation is about just simply, or I mean, not simply, but largely reframing one world into another, and how much of it is completely changing that world. And, I feel that for so many readers, because Yiddish is such a marked language, that's what I'm getting at, as a different, the Yiddish is a marked language in a way that many national languages may not be. But because it is such a marked language, there is the temptation, or there's the invitation to Yiddishize, or Judaize, or Europeanize this world in a certain kind of way. And I think that's, Aaron, that's at the heart of the conundrum here of the translator, if you see what I'm getting at.
Yes, indeed. And perhaps just to bring it back to the reason why I did this in the first place, I wanted to have Harry Potter. I'm a kid of, the suburbs in New Jersey, and I wanted Harry Potter in my native language. And so there are opportunities to perhaps more explicitly Judaize Harry Potter, and that's been done in the realm of fan fiction. And I felt like I had to give the people Harry Potter and not Herschel Tepper. And so some sacrifices have to be made, especially for a book which is in and of itself so marked and so well known, and people know the text by heart. And so if you deviate from it, you will get some angry letters. And so one does what one can. And yes, the challenges make it all the more enjoyable.
Questions from the audience. This has been a really rich discussion of translation, Arun, and I think part of it is you and the depths to which you were willing to go with Yiddish to figure out the appropriate Yiddish for this actually quite broad and folkloric book that J.K. Rowling's written. I mean, I think that's part of its appeal. Other questions about the process of translation, about the book itself?
In the meantime, I'm just throwing in a couple of links into the chat. One is a link to purchase the translation itself. And I'm also adding in a link to, unfortunately, it's me reading the first chapter on a less than ideal quality microphone. But you can hear the first chapter, including Hagrid and McGonagall speaking in dialect on YouTube.
It's really an achievement. I was just looking before you started today at the zoo passage, and obviously this becomes much stronger later in later books, but parcel tongue, right? I mean, you don't have much parcel tongue there, but what do you do with parcel tongue in Yiddish? It's wonderful. I mean, it's a wonderful opportunity. All of these problems of translation are actually, opportunities in translation to play. And it's such a playful book anyway that I can imagine it was kind of fun. How would you, would you play with that, or just kind of make it, throw in a lot of samics and call it a day?
probably mostly thrown a lot of summits. I haven't quite thought about how to translate parcel tongue because, again, I've been told that Schlangensprache is not an option. So, so one is forced to be a
And
bit more.
Schlange does mean something, right?
It does.
We would
It's a
agree.
euphemism. It's a
Yes,
euphemism.
I know that. I just want to make sure.
In Yiddish, the word itself is not marked, but knowing that this is for an American audience,
Yes.
one has to sacrifice certain things.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure it was not my imagination.
It is not.
Yeah, it's clearly not Schlangensprache, but there are other words for snakes, right? And yet, just as we have it in English.
Yes, yes, indeed there are.
Yeah.
It will take some thought. I think I currently am in the middle of translating chapter 7 of book 2, and I don't think that the word parcel tongue comes up until chapter 8. So you got me at the wrong time, but I'll let you know what I come up with.
We'll ask you again next time what you did
Wonderful.
with the word, with the term parcel tongue, but then also, you have various, moments in the last book where people are speaking parcel tongue and what sort of accent will, Voldemort's
Lisa, are you up?
Yeah, Lisa, you put a little clap in the chat. I don't know if you
sorry,
had a
no,
comment.
I wanted to raise my hand. Have you had any young readers of Yiddish read it and react for you? Sort of who would be about the right age to read the book and who have the Yiddish to read it. I wondered if they, what they had to say about it.
That's a wonderful question. I know that some children from the Yiddishist world have read it, and well, all I got so far is that they liked it. I actually have a phone call scheduled with a 7-year-old to talk about it tomorrow. So once again, timing is just a little bit off. But I also know that there are children within the Hasidic world who are reading this book. It turns out the fringes of the Hasidic world are much more porous than we might imagine. At the very beginning of the pandemic, a father in a Hasidic family biked up from Williamsburg to get a copy of the book for his children, and it turns out they've already read it in English. And so, yes, the phenomenon of bilingual literacy within the Hasidic world is a whole subject unto itself. But I know that they have read it. I was told that they found the orthography, which is a bit different from Hasidic orthography, to be a little bit unusual, but once they got past that, they were able to get along just fine. But I think they liked it. I'm sorry, I don't have anything more qualitative, but there are some children reading it.
That's awesome. Wonderful.
Well, if there are any other questions, we can respond to them now. If not, please join me in thanking Arun for joining us, and thank all of you for attending and for your support of the program this year. Congratulations on making it to the end of this quarter.